This is Faithful Sayings, broadcast by the Leon Valley Church of Christ. Thanks for tuning in. We're back in Ecclesiastes chapter 5, and we're going to be looking at the latter portion of Ecclesiastes 5 today in our study. Ecclesiastes 5 and verse 10 says, "He who loves money will not be satisfied with money, nor he who loves abundance with its income. This too is vanity." Somebody said that trying to make a discontented person happy is like trying to fill a sieve with water. And I think that that's a great picture of what Solomon is describing in this verse, that when we give ourselves over to the love of money, we will never be satisfied. However much you pour into that sieve, right, it's always going to run out too fast to catch up. There's always going to be a hole there that consumes whatever's put into it. And I think this is the reality that God wants us to see. And also the truth that the devil works diligently to conceal from us and conceal it with his lies and his propaganda. And his great lie, right, is if you make a certain salary, at least his great lie with regard to this subject is that if you make a certain salary or you get a bigger house or you get power, prestige, then you can, then you'll be happy. Then you'll find satisfaction, then you'll find fulfillment. He does that with everything, right? If you sleep with this person or that person, then you'll be happy, right? So you could apply that to any of the areas that Solomon has been talking about. And so Solomon is saying here, no, this is not the case. Seeking happiness and wealth is vanity. And the truth is, if you can't be content without it, then you're not going to be happy when you get it. I think many pass through this life never content with their circumstances, and their discontentment leads them into all sorts of other sin. One man said, "A content person is never poor, and a discontent person is never rich." If anything is worse than the addiction money brings, it's the emptiness that it leaves. And don't misunderstand, it's not, just as the Bible speaks here in this case of love of money, it's not, that's the emphasis, right? It's not that having wealth or having money is wrong or that it's sinful in of itself, but it's always the place where that it holds in our hearts, right? This love that the Bible speaks of, that's the issue with man and seeking a greater fulfillment in wealth. So man with eternity in his heart needs better nourishment than that, right? Solomon said earlier in the book that God has placed eternity in the heart of man. And he goes on to say in verse 11 that when good things increase, those who consume them increase. So what is the advantage to their owners except to look on? And I don't know if Solomon intended that to be funny, but it's kind of comical to me, that he's kind of pushing the point further now that not only does this leave you feeling empty, but I want you to think about, as your net worth increases, your expenses are going to increase usually, and the expectations of other people are going to increase. And so Solomon is saying, what is the point except for you just to watch that happen? And you have all this stuff, the good things are increasing, but you're going to have greater responsibilities and greater expenses. And so Solomon also writes that the poor is hated even by his neighbor, but those who love the rich are many. That's actually in Proverbs 14:20. And that many will seek the favor of a generous man, and every man is a friend to him who gives gifts. And so as in Ecclesiastes, Solomon, he's not commenting on the morality of what he's just stated there, but he's just stating a fact that it's, and it's also not a commentary on the quality of friends that he's talking about that are going to be drawn to a person with wealth. He's just simply describing the realities of the world. And so he's saying, be careful that you're not, go at this with eyes wide open, right? You're going to be burdening yourself in a way by in kind of unforeseen ways that he's trying to help us see by giving your life to the love of riches. In verse 12, he follows in Ecclesiastes 5. Now, the next verse says, "The sleep of the laboring man is sweet, and the abundance of the rich will not permit him to sleep." And again, it's another profound observation, right? The laborer has a whole lot less to worry about, but the person who has given themselves to wealth and has accrued riches, he has, again, more worries and more responsibilities. And Solomon is saying less sleep as a result. And, when we think about New Testament teaching and what Paul tells us, what tells Christians about the importance of godliness or reverence for God with contentment, he says that's a means of great gain in 1 Timothy 6 and verse 6. Right? And in that same context, he describes how there again, many people who were at one time godly, who have given themselves over to the love of money, have pierced themselves through with many griefs. Right? So it's just kind of this, this constant trouble, right? But if we're healthy and we have food and we can be content with what we have, with our family and our clothes on our backs, what more do we need, right? As Paul makes the point there, with food and covering, with these we shall be content. If God has blessed you with greater wealth than other folks, well, then use it to glorify Him, so that your reward will be great in heaven. Don't allow your heart to trust in that wealth, or trust it to satisfy you or save your soul. It's not, that's foolishness, is what Solomon is saying here. And it's fickle and uncertain, right? Wealth is contingent upon, to some degree, as the Bible teaches, your willingness to work and the degree to which you work, but it's much more contingent upon external circumstances, and a lot of things that we can't control. Markets and economies and just life and in general, and our own physical health and ability to work and to think. And so many of those things are just completely out of our control. He says in verses 13 through 17, "Riches kept for their owner to their hurt, but those riches perish through misfortune." And so wealth doesn't bless the life of every wealthy person, Solomon is saying, especially those who keep their riches with an ungenerous and miserly kind of hand, like a tight fist. He's saying you do that to your own hurt. And God is showing us the foolishness of holding on to wealth in an ungenerous way. And this really fits with a lot of I think a major theme that runs throughout Ecclesiastes, and that is Solomon will say a number of different things that indicate that we should just enjoy the enjoyable things as they come, right? Because as he revisits the uncertainty of life and the certainty of death and the march of time, again, these things that are beyond our control, he'll say, enjoy the good meal, enjoy the time with your spouse, enjoy the time that you have under the sun, right? And it's not a like a fatalistic type of viewpoint he's calling us to have, like, well, this is all there is, and you don't know when your day is going to end, so just just make the best of it. That's kind of what he's saying, but also there's more to it than that, right? He's not discounting the spiritual side of it, right? In other words, he's not saying just enjoy the enjoyable things in this life as they come. He says do that, but also remember you're going to be held accountable in the end for how you used your wealth, and if you were content, and did you ultimately fear God and keep His commandments, right? Which is where he's headed with the whole book. And this is just one facet, that he's focused on in this chapter with regard to wealth. It will disappear suddenly, or it can, through misfortune, as he says there in verse 14. And in the end, right, in the final analysis, you lose all material wealth when you leave this world. And so this is what Solomon wants us to remember too. And in fact, Paul, I'm more and more persuaded, had this particular text in mind as he was writing 1 Timothy 6, because Solomon will, use the exact words, or rather Paul will use the same words as Solomon in verse 15 of Ecclesiastes 5. Ecclesiastes 5:15, he had come naked from his mother's womb, so he will return as he came. He will take nothing from the fruit of his labor that he can carry in his hand. Does that sound familiar? No. That's what Paul says. We have brought nothing into this world, and we can take nothing out of it. And Job echoes the same words in Job 121. And so all of this to say, why get so worked up over such things that we can't take with us in the end? Right? Whether you leave in an hour from now, or a day from now, or years from now, whenever it comes, whenever your time comes to leave this world, you're not taking anything with you. It's just going to be you. And, it's all of our stuff, all of our, bank accounts and houses and libraries and cars and accolades. Is any of that going to matter in eternity when you're standing before Jesus to be judged? Well, no. Not the amount of it anyway. How you used it is what's going to matter. And so Jesus' instruction is to lay up treasure in heaven. Right? Lay up treasure in heaven. Where your treasure is, there your heart will be also. You can't take your wealth with you when you die, but you can use it here and now in a meaningful way so that when you find yourself in eternity, and you will have stored up treasure for yourself as a good foundation for the future. These are Paul's words. He says, store up treasure for yourself as a good foundation for the future. What future is he talking about? Well, eternity. He doesn't mean here and now in this life, because Paul knows it's going to end, just like Solomon. And then he says, so that you can take hold of that which is truly life. That which is truly life. Eternal life, right? So pursuing and building wealth for the sake of wealth and having bigger and better things, that eventually leads to loneliness. It leads to sorrow. It leads to anger. Just revisit Ecclesiastes chapter 2 again and look at Solomon's frustration there and how he describes his loneliness and his sorrow and his just utter disappointment, as he just gave himself, or as he describes, I didn't deny myself anything. Whatever my eyes saw, he says, I just went after it. And, and then begins, vanity, all is vanities. He was just completely dejected. So verse 17 here of Ecclesiastes chapter 5, he says, all his life he also eats in darkness with great irritation, sickness, and anger. You see how he's coming back to that point again? When you go down that road, it's not what the devil would have you believe, that it's just, jubilation and a life of ease and, whatever promises he makes. Solomon is saying, no, it's just the opposite, actually. And so finally Solomon says in verse 18, it's good and fitting. Here's an example of one of those phrases I was talking about earlier, where he just says, enjoy the good things as they come, and hold things with an open hand. Verse 18, it is good and fitting for one to eat and drink, to enjoy the good of all his labor in which he toils under the sun all the days of his life, which God gives him, for it is his heritage. And so he circles around to his central theme. Notice he brings the goodness of God back into the discussion, right? He's turning our attention back to the spiritual. Fear God, keep his commandments, appreciate his gifts. There's much to be enjoyed, but you can't fall for the delusion that what is to be enjoyed is an end in and of itself. Don't fall for the delusion, or the illusion, I guess, that pleasure, joy, even productivity, work, and the rewards of work, wealth in its various forms, none of those things are ends in and of themselves, but rather they're all gifts from God, and they can only truly be enjoyed and experienced in a meaningful way, a fulfilling way, when we are dedicated to God, dedicated to serving God. And this, again, is something that Solomon has already touched upon back in chapter 3, just a few chapters earlier. I know that there is nothing better for a man than to rejoice and to do good in one's lifetime. Moreover, that every man eats and drinks and sees good in all his labor. It is the gift of God. So you see what he's doing here, right? Even work itself, again, and the satisfaction that one can get from honest work and labor, whether it's physical or otherwise, that is a blessing from God, right? So God has designed us to be productive and creative, reflective, just as He is, not to just wallow around in the rewards of those things, but ultimately use them to serve Him and express our gratitude for those gifts, right? And so lastly here, let's just say that Christians, Paul in 1 Timothy 6, the Holy Spirit inspired him to use basically the same verbiage that Solomon is using here. And so that tells us, I think, that these principles are timeless, and also that Christians are not immune to the call of materialism. And, as Paul says, even in Paul's time, many had abandoned the faith to chase riches to the ruin of their souls. I mentioned that text earlier. It's 1 Timothy 6 and verse 10 that Paul says that some, by longing for money, have wandered away from the faith, and they've pierced themselves through with many griefs. So, when you reflect upon that, you think, well, how many since Paul's time and before Paul's time pursued wealth at the expense of their families and their health and morality and God? In this particular case, Paul is talking about Christians who have abandoned worshiping God, and now they're trying to get rich by deceiving and defrauding others. So we can easily forget. Christians too can arrive at a point where they forget that a righteous God sees all that they do. They forget how good God is and His good promises, and they refuse to see the blessings that He's given them, and they're discontent. Right? But contentment will be ours when we find that our wealth is in love and fellowship of God. Right? That a truly enriched life is only as enriched as the relationships that we have, and there's no greater one than the one we can have with God through Jesus Christ, who made that possible. Physical blessings are good things, and we should be good stewards of those things. But when we have God and we have fellowship with God, we have all things. He who loves money will not be satisfied with money, nor he who loves abundance with its income. This too is vanity. Appreciate you tuning in.